This week's Sedra is Beshalach, and of course, Beshalach discusses a Kriyas Yamsuf, a Paro, all of a sudden changes what was his attitude, and he runs after the Jewish people, and he catches up with them when they're standing by the sea, by the Yamsuf. And then the whole miracle of the splitting of the sea and the drowning of Paro's soldiers. The Medrash says that Paro himself was not drowned. And then the Torah tells us that the Jewish people left Yamsuf, the area of the Yam, of the sea, and they went to Midbar Shur, to the desert of Shur, and they went there 3 days, and they went there for 3 days without water, and then they came to Marah, which literally means bitter, and there they found a body of water, but the waters were bitter, and that's the reason the place was called Marah. And because of this, they complained. The Jewish people, the Jewish people complained against Moshe, screaming to him, "What are we going to do? What are we going to drink?" And Moshe prayed to Hakadosh Baruch Hu, to God, and then. And as a result of that, the Moshe was told by God to throw a tree that was bitter into the water, and a miraculous event took place, and the water became sweet, and the Jewish people were able to drink the water. Now the first question we have to ask is, they saw this miraculous event. According to the Medrash, it wasn't just the Jewish people that saw the miraculous event, but waters all over the world split. And it caused the whole civilized world at that time, all of mankind, was aware, or would become aware, if you don't want to take the Medrash literally, of the miracle that took place at the splitting of the sea. And then all of a sudden, and then when they sang the Shira, they concluded the Shira, Hashem Yimloch L'olam Va'ed. They saw this not as a one-time relationship with God, but they proclaimed God as king forever. And as the Targum Onkelos points out, when they proclaimed him as God as king forever, so it wasn't just that in the future he'll be king, but they said that they recognized and they accepted him as God even now. And then all of a sudden, after 3 days, they start their rebellion against Moshe, and ultimately a rebellion against Moshe is a rebellion against God. So how are we to understand it? Okay, they were thirsty, they needed water. To a certain degree, their lives were at stake. But it could have been done in a different way. After all, it was only a few days ago that they saw such miraculous events, and they responded to those miraculous events in an appropriate manner, and recognizing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the personal relationship, Zekeli Van Vehu, the personal relationship they had with God. So how are we to understand this? Now, the Gemara in Bava Kama mentions that the Dorshei Rishimos, so my sense is the Dorshei Rishimos are the ones who, the Dorshei Rishimos were those who expounded on the Bible, on the words of the Bible in medrashic form. And they said that when it says in this week's Sedra that they went 3 days without water, so of course the literal translation is certainly true, but it also, water, Torah is compared to water, and there are psukim that indicate that. Whoever is thirsty, let him go to the water, let him go. The pasuk in Yeshaya, let him go to involve himself in drinking the waters of Torah. And because of that, our sages, and the way the Gemara says it, that after 3 days of going without the waters of Torah, they were nilu. They became exhausted, fatigued, tired. And that when one becomes dehydrated, there is this feeling of tiredness. And because of this, they were led to complain. In a sense, to initiate a sort of a rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu, screaming at him. So in a sense, they were spiritually thirsty. And when they were spiritually thirsty, so because of this, the Talmud in Bava Kama, Talmud Bavli, says that the Nevi'im Shebenehem, the prophets among them, apparently they were prophets when the Jewish people left Egypt, who, besides Moshe Rabbeinu, the Nevi'im Shebenehem, the prophets among them, instituted that the Torah should be read. There shouldn't be 3 days without Torah. So they instituted that the Torah should be read on Shabbos, it should be read on Monday, and it should be read on Thursday. And so because of the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah was instituted because of what happened in Marah. Now, it's interesting to note that the Rambam in mentioning that about the initiation of the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah, he doesn't say, as the Gemara, as the Bavli says, that it was initiated by the Nevi'im Shebenehem, by the prophets among them, but he says Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest of the Nevi'im, Av LeNevi'im. But the question is, and what the Rambam says has foundation in the Yerushalmi, that Moshe instituted it. Now, it's very likely that Moshe instituted, and this is what the Kesef Mishnah implies, that Moshe instituted it in conjunction with the other prophets. But the question is, why does the Bavli, our Gemara, if Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who instituted it, and Moshe Rabbeinu is the Av LeNevi'im, is the father of all prophets, both the prophets that were before him and the prophets after him, as we say in the Animamins. So why emphasize, and the Bavli doesn't even mention Moshe Rabbeinu. So why emphasize the idea that it was instituted by the Nevi'im, by the prophets. And so now it's interesting to note that Rabbeinu Manoach, that's one of the commentaries. Rabbeinu Manoach, who one of the commentaries on the Rambam, so he states that shortly after mentioning about the incident at Marah, which is the foundation for the instituting that we should not have 3 days without a public reading of the Torah. So shortly afterwards, there are some incidents, most of them where the Jews rebelled against God because they didn't have food, they ran out of food, or because they wanted meat, all kinds of different incidents of rebellion. And there are some incidents that are not of rebellion, but short incidents. They went from place to place. And at the end of this week's Sedra, the Torah tells us that they were in Rephidim, and after Rephidim, they went away from Rephidim and they were attacked by Amalek, by Yavo Amalek. He says shortly afterwards, Rabbeinu Manoach says, by Yavo Amalek. And he says it's because by Yavo Amalek comes shortly after the Marah, the incident in Marah, that the Chachamim instituted, not the Chachamim, that the Nevi'im, that the prophets instituted the reading of Shabbos, Monday and Thursday. Now we have to understand, and what he says that somehow Amalek came, the Torah tells us, because in Rephidim, the Jewish people said, in Rephidim, the Jewish people said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu umayim. They raised doubts as to, and there also was a lack of water, and Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock, and water came out, and there they said, the Torah tells us they tested God, and they tested God, and because the Jewish people there said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu umayim, is God among us and God isn't among us. And then as a result of that, in Rephidim, Vayavo Amalek came and attacked the Jewish people. And according to Rabbeinu Manoach, that's the reason why Kriyas HaTorah was instituted in such a manner at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, was instituted in such a manner so there shouldn't be 3 days without water, without reading the Torah in a public manner. We have to understand, what is the connection between the event, other than both of them are dealing with the lack of water? What is the connection between Marah and Rephidim? Between the event of Marah, where the Jewish people went for 3 days without water, and Rephidim, where they were attacked by Amalek. And Rabbeinu Manoach connects the two. Now, the fact that Amalek came because the Jewish people were not involved with Torah, that is a comment in the Mechilta, and some say, the Medrash says, why is it called Rephidim? Sherafu Yedeihem et Divrei Torah. In a sense, they were not involved in Torah. So it does have a basis. But Rabbeinu Manoach creates a connection between the two. And I want to understand the connection. What does Amalek add to the incident over there? Now, we could suggest, but I think it's more than just that. We could suggest, because it's interesting, by Amalek, the Parsha of Amalek, it says, Ksov zo sikaron b'sefer, the sin ba'asne Yeshua. Write this as a remembrance in the book. And there is a dispute among the Rishonim. What does the book have reference to? Some say it has reference to a book that we no longer have. Sefer Milchemes Hashem, a book that talks about the wars of God. And some say it has reference to the Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah has, so Moshe is commanded to write Parshios about Amalek in the Sefer Torah. Now, the Sefer Torah was only completed, certainly this Sefer Torah was only completed only at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, 40 years later. But we find that they had scrolls. The Medrash mentions that even when they were in Egypt, they had scrolls of Parshios about the Yavos that dealt with the patriarchs. But it wasn't yet a Sefer. But we do see that there was a Sefer Habris. A Sefer Habris that was written at the time of Matan Torah, that included in it many of the Parshios of the Torah. So whatever Sefer they had, there probably had to be in it the Parsha of Zachar. Remember what Amalek did, and if it had Zachar, it certainly had to have Vayavo Amalek. Amalek came and attacked the Jewish people. So here, and the question is, how often on a D'Oraisa level, we know, on a rabbinic level, we read Parshas Zachar, besides Parshas Kiseitze, we read Parshas Zachar. We read Parshas Zachar. Well, we read Parshas Zachar the Shabbos before Purim. But it's interesting that the Chinuch discusses what is the mitzvah d'oraisa, the biblical mitzvah. Of course, there was no Purim. Parshas Zachar. To read Parshas Zachar, I meant the Shabbos before Purim. There was no Purim till the time of Mordechai and Esther, and there was a mitzvah d'oraisa. There was a mitzvah of the Torah to remember what Amalek did. And according to those who say that the mitzvah of remembering what Amalek did, it was to be fulfilled by the reading of Parshas Zachar. So why is it it was to be read? How often do you have to read it? How often? So the Rosh says once in 12 months, because people after 12 months begin to forget. The Chinuch mentions an opinion that it has to be read. It depends on the custom of the where a person is living. If a person is part of a community where they read the Torah over a period of a year, then he has to hear Parshas Zachar once a year. And he says, and I don't know where this custom existed, if they read the Torah over a period of 2 years, then he has to hear the Parshas Zachar once in the 2-year cycle. And if he reads Parshas Zachar once in 3 years, reads the Torah, the whole Torah over a 3-year cycle, which was the custom in Eretz Yisrael. I'm talking In the early days, even there's the early days, meaning even the time of the Rishonim, there was a custom in Eretz Yisrael to read the Torah not over a year cycle, but over a 3-year cycle. So then you have midiraisa biblically, you have to see it over a 3-year cycle. So in other words, there's an implication in Parshas Zachar. There's an implication in Parshas Zachar about the Torah being read over whatever cycle it is. Just writing it in the book, that doesn't make it a zikaron. It's only if it's read. So there's a discussion, so there's an implication about the custom or the halacha or the requirement of reading the Torah in Parshas Zachar. Okay, but we still have to understand the connection between Parshas Amalek and the Parsha of Marah. Now, now the Gemara questions the assertion of the Gemara, the assertion that Moshe Rabbeinu or the Nevi'im, the prophets in the time of Moshe were the ones who instituted that the Sefer Torah has to be read on Shabbos and on Monday and on Thursday. Why? Because we are told that Ezra instituted it. So the Gemara said, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it, or the prophets in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it. But Ezra came and he strengthened the requirement. When Moshe Rabbeinu came, when Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it, there was only a requirement that 3 psukim, 3 verses be recited. And Ezra came and he instituted that no, you need at least 10 verses to be recited in each reading, and also that you need 3 people to get aliyas. 3 people perhaps could be associated with Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, or with Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. But whatever it is, Ezra instituted that there has to be 3 aliyas. Each person has to have at least 3 psukim, and one of the 3 has to have at least 4 psukim. So there'll be at least a total of 10 psukim for the kriya, for the reading, for each reading. That's what Ezra instituted. And also, Ezra also instituted that there should be a reading Shabbos afternoon because of Yoshei Kronos. There's a dispute what Yoshei Kronos means. Some say it was people who would otherwise waste their time. Some say it has reference to people who were businessmen and didn't have time to hear the reading on Monday and Thursday. So they instituted a special reading because of that on Shabbos afternoon. Okay. Now, it's interesting when you take a look at the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah. So first he mentions that Moshe Rabbeinu instituted that the Kriyas HaTorah, the reading of the Torah, should be 3 times a week, Shabbos, Monday, and Thursday. And then he comes and says, but he does not say how many psukim, how many verses Moshe Rabbeinu instituted that it should be. It doesn't say how many psukim it has to be. And then he says Ezra came, and Ezra said that it has to be 10 psukim and 3 people get an aliyas. 3 people. In other words, Ezra strengthened what Moshe Rabbeinu did. Now the question is, once the Rambam mentions, and even if he didn't mention, what Moshe Rabbeinu instituted, that it should be that the Torah should be read on these 3 days of the week. So the Rambam should have mentioned what exactly was the takana, what Moshe Rabbeinu required. In other words, he required only 3 psukim. And Ezra came and said that it's 10. Why should he have done that? Let's say for some reason, it's impossible to read 10 psukim. And a person could not fulfill what Ezra instituted. At least they should be able to fulfill what Moshe Rabbeinu instituted. And you cannot suggest that Ezra undid or negated completely the takana of Moshe Rabbeinu, what Moshe Rabbeinu instituted, because we know, as the Gemara in Megillah, and we'll get into it, says that one Bezdin, a later Bezdin, could not negate what an earlier or a greater Bezdin instituted. And certainly there was no Bezdin as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, as great as the Bezdin of the prophets at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And to a certain degree, this question, except that he proves the point from a certain expression in the Rambam, this question is asked by my uncle, except that my uncle doesn't deduce that doesn't point to the fact that the Rambam doesn't mention what Moshe Rabbeinu instituted. So the question is, how is it that Ezra had the ability? The Rambam doesn't mention, he just mentioned Moshe Rabbeinu instituted three times, and then he says that Ezra came and added to it, but he doesn't say what Moshe Rabbeinu did. So we have to understand. We have to be able to understand this, how to answer this question. Now, my uncle writes, it's a beautiful piece of Torah in Shiurim L'Zeicha B'Mari Chelak Aleph on this. But while some of the ideas that I'm going to suggest are based on something that he said there, my answer is somewhat different than what he suggested. And I would really go into what he said, but I don't want to go too long. So I'm just going to mention what I think is the what I think is the explanation. Now, the Gemara in Megillah discusses that we know that the Megillah is read. Daf Yomi now is learning Masechus Megillah. So the Gemara Megillah says, the beginning of the Gemara Megillah, that of course the Megillah tells us explicitly that the Megillah has to be read on the 14th of Adar in non-walled cities, and on the 15th of Adar in the cities that were walled at the time that Yoshua ben Nun entered the land of Israel. But then the Gemara mentions that there were people who lived in the villages And there were various reasons for it, but it was necessary because of the way they worked on behalf of the people of the cities. It became necessary to have additional days for them to read the Megillah. So there were the Megillah. So additional days were instituted: the 11th of Adar, the 12th of Adar, and the 13th of Adar. And the Gemara says the later Chachamim, the later sages, could not institute that themselves. As we mentioned, a Bezdin that was not as great as the previous Bezdin cannot negate what the previous Bezdin did. And the Bezdin at the time of Mordechai and Esther had Nevi'im beinehem, had prophets among them, as the Rambam emphasized. So later, but they did not have Nevi'im. So how was it possible? How is it possible for them to change? When the Megillah only mentions the 14th and 13th, they added the 11th and the 12th and the 13th. And the 11th and 12th and 13th could only be used when those days fell out on a Monday and Thursday, when the people of the villages would be going into the big cities. Some say, Rashi says, because the people in the villages were somewhat illiterate, they were not able to read the Megillah themselves. They needed someone in the big cities to read the Megillah for them. Others explain it differently, whatever the reason is. But Monday and Thursday, they used to go in. Why did they go in Monday and Thursday? Because Ezra instituted that Ezra instituted but he didn't. The courts in the big city should sit every Monday and Thursday, and the people in the villages, they had to attend to things that necessitated the Bezdin.
I pressed the wrong button by mistake. Can you please unmute, Rabbi?
I'm sorry. So they because of that, the Chachamim, and sometime after the time of Ezra, after the time of Ezra, the Chachamim after the time of Ezra instituted that the Megillah could be read in the big cities for the villagers on the 11th and the 12th and the 13th. This has no application today. The Gemara points out that it doesn't apply anymore. But the Gemara says, how could they institute it? The Megillah says only the 14th and 15th. So the Gemara says we have drashos, we have words, kayamim, asher nachu bahem haYehudim. There's all kinds of implications from the words that empowered the Chachamim to institute extra days. And Yerushalmi asks a question. He says, who wrote the Megillah? The Megillah was written by Mordechai and Esther. And that was before the time of Ezra. So how could they institute extra days based on the fact that Ezra would say that the Bezdin in the various cities would sit on Monday and Thursday, and these were days that the people from the villages came into the cities? So the Gemara says, was an asmachta, they relied on it. What does that mean? So how does that answer the question? But the simple answer is that Mordechai and Esther were aware of the possibility that in future generations, there will be a need to add additional days because of changing conditions. So they instituted it to a certain degree. The Sam Sofer says this. They instituted that the Chachamim, the sages of future generations, could add days, and those days would have to be either the 11th or the 12th or the 13th. Any one of those days. And it seems, according to some Rishonim, that already at the time of Mordechai and Esther, there were certain situations where they had to use the 11th, 12th, and 13th for people who were going on a boat, whatever it might be. But so the Mordechai and Esther were aware of the changing situations. And because of this, they instituted that the sages of future generations should be able to do it. And after talking about that, the Gemara tells us talks about many different things. The Gemara mentions that there was a discussion. There was about, we know we have the Sofit letters, the letters that end, that are different when it's at the end of the word or in the middle of the word. Let's say amen. Amen, when it's in the middle of the word, is written one way. When it's at the end of the word, it's written a different way. And nun, samach, no, not samach, I'm sorry, mem, a nun, a tzadik. So pay, through letters that, and but apparently at a certain point, the Gemara tells us that they forgot. They forgot is a discussion itself, and not for right now. So for Mamru, they forgot which mem goes in the middle of the word and which mem goes at the end of the word. So for Mamru, who was it so for? So Rashi says, Nevi'ei Hadoros, the prophets of the generation. So the question is, the halacha is that halacha cannot be determined on the basis of the nevuah, on basis of prophecy. A matter of fact, according to the Rambam's opinion, if somebody will come and say, a Navi will come and say that there is a machlokis about this and that and halacha, and I inquired from heaven, and heaven told me that the halacha is like this opinion. We sometimes find people who think they're Nevi'im that do this, and they say that heaven informed them as a result of their request, according to some opinions, what the halacha is. So there are Navi HaSheker, there are false Nevi'im, the Chayiv Misa. It's a capital offense. So how are we to understand? The people forgot which letters, very likely the reason they forgot, although there's many different opinions what the reason is, but the likely reason is because the Hebrew alphabet changed. And the old alphabet, they did not have two mems. It was only one mem. They didn't have these end letters that were special. So the Hebrew alphabet changed in the time of Ezra. So and they didn't know which way it was. At the time of Matan Torah, both ways were given over, and they didn't know which way it was. So because of that, the Nevi'im told them. So they passed in the Shiloh. But it seems from Rabbeinu Hananel, it seems that it was a Masorah. In other words, in the time of Matan Torah, both forms of the alphabet was given over. But for whatever reason, only one form was used throughout the first Commonwealth, or at a certain point during the first Commonwealth. And then when Ezra came, he instituted that the other form should start being used, which had some familiarity that was close with the alphabet that the Jews had in Babylonian exile. So it was given over from the time of Matan Torah, from one generation to the other, but not everybody in the generation knew it. Who knew it? But we could say it was only the prophets. That's what Rashi means, Nevi Hadoros. We know that a prophet is somebody who brings a message from God. But prophets were more than just that. And there was a Masorah that was handed over from the prophets of one generation to the other generation. And they would give over certain things when it was appropriate for them to give that over. So when the alphabet had to be changed, so it was the prophets who received the Masorah, who received the tradition that was given over from generation to generation as to how the letters have to be written. And then the Marah talks about the different targums. It says that the targum, there was the targum of Onkelos that was written in the time that there was targum Onkelos, and the targum of Yonasan ben Uziel. Yonasan ben Uziel. The targum of Yonasan ben Uziel was on the prophets. Targum Onkelos was on the Torah. And when Yonasan ben Uziel mentioned wrote his targum, his translation on the prophets, so Eretz Yisrael shook. The whole land of Eretz Yisrael shook. Whether you have to take it literally or not, it means it had a certain impact. And the Yonasan ben Uziel said, I did not write this targum in defense of himself for my honor or the honor of my household, but I wrote this targum because there shouldn't be arguments how to understand the words of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. And the Gemara requests, why is it that when Onkelos wrote his targum, so when Onkelos wrote his targum, so it didn't shake? And the Gemara tells us that because Onkelos explained the Torah. The Torah is very clear what it means. The Nevi'im Uksuvim are literally missing words. And some psukim with Onkelos ben Uziel, when you read Onkelos ben Uziel, it is a complete rewriting of what the prophets say. In other words, to a certain degree, the Nevi'im, the prophets, were not written in their complete form. Words were left out. The question is, why were words left out? And it says that Yonasan ben Uziel, he wrote it Mipi Chagai Zcharia Malachai. He wrote it from Chagei Zechariah and Malachi, who were the last prophets of the Jewish people. And Tosfos already points out, some zeals hundreds of years after Chagei Zechariah and Malachi. But it said there was a tradition given down from Chagei Zechariah and Malachi that reached Jonathan ben Uziel. So why emphasize Mepi Chagei Zechariah and Malachi? What is the emphasis for? But I think the answer is very simple. And so why is it that Nevi'im is different than Torah? Nevi'im, words are left out. Now, I once heard from my father, not to answer this question, but as a general statement. My father told me that Reb Chaim, my great-grandfather, once said, what is the status of the Nevi'im and Ksuvim at the time of Matan Torah? Because we know, our sages tell us, that the Nevi'im and Ksuvim were given at the time of Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah. What was the status of Nevi'im and Ksuvim? The status of Nevi'im and Ksuvim was like oral Torah, except the word, perhaps, the words themselves were given over also. So in other words, until the Navi put the Nevi'im and Ksuvim to writing, the Nevi'im and Ksuvim had the status of oral Torah. So we could say that even when it was put into writing, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God wanted, and the Nevi'im, based on their sensing what God wanted, to retain that status, that there should be a need for the Masorah to explain the Nevi'im Ksuvim, even the simple reading of the Nevi'im Ksuvim, of the prophets. So words were left out. Again, how was this given over? This is the Masorah HaNevi'im. This was given over from the Navi, the Nevi'ei Hadoros, the Nevi'im from generation to generation gave this over. And and then also the Torah mentioned, the Gemara mentions there that Daniel did not have the status of a Navi, even though he had the power to see revelation. But he wasn't the Navi, he wasn't the prophet. Why? Because he wasn't sent on a mission to the Jewish people by God. Now, the question is, what is the connection between all these things? But I think the connection is that all of these things are based on the Masorah HaNevi'im. The determination of which days the Megillah should be read was given over to Nevi'im from generation to generation. Ultimately, it might have been transferred to the Chachamim at the end of the period of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. And then the Yonasan ben Uziel, he gave me Pi Chagei Zechariah Malachi. He revealed the unwritten parts of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. How did he know it? From Chagei Zechariah Malachi. Why? Because it was a Masorah of the Nevi'im until Chagei Zechariah Malachi. And then afterwards, they transferred that Masorah, that heritage. They transferred it to the Chachamim, to the sages, and then it reached Jonathan ben Uziel, who made it public. And they mentioned Beniel, that even though Neil had the powers of a prophet, but he wasn't considered, as Rashi later on points out, one of the prophets of the generations, because he wasn't sent on a mission to the Jewish people. Only one who was sent on a mission to the Jewish people was a prophet of the Masorah HaNevi'im, of the giving over from one Navi to another Navi, because you have to be involved with the people. Now, I think that to a certain degree, that's the idea here by Kriyas HaTorah. Now, what was the problem? How did the Jews sin by Marah? What was the sin? They just said, Oz Yosher. They said, Hashem Yimloch Lolam Voed. They proclaim God as king. But when proclaiming God as king presented a challenge to the Jewish people, because the Jewish people, in a sense, when God became king and Moshe was God's representative, when God became king, so they suffered for over 200 years at the hands of the man that they recognized as king, as Paro. And there was bitterness among the Jewish people. The bitterness arose because of what happened with Paro, what Paro did to them. But there was a transference from one king to the other king. And the Jewish people rebelled, were rebelling against Moshe, rebelling against God, because they represented the new leaders. So they recognized God as king, but ultimately the recognition of God as king caused a problem for them. We have to recognize God as king, but we have to recognize what God does for us. And we have to turn to God for help for the problems that others create for us, not blame it upon God. And so this was the problem. And I think the same thing is true. That's why it says Nevi'im Shebeneim. Of course, it was Moshe Rabbeinu. But Moshe Rabbeinu made certain takanas as Moshe Rabbeinu. And certain takanas, certain things he instituted as one of the prophets. Why does it emphasize in our Gemara that he do it as one of the prophets? Because the nature of the mitzvah of reading the Torah would be dependent upon the evaluation of the needs that arise in future generations. And that's why when Ezra and the Jewish people returned from Babylonian exile, from their first exile, Ezra sensed there was a need. There was a need again to change the Kriyas Torah. More was necessary. Not only that, Ezra instituted, we don't do it today for obvious reasons. And the Ram says it's only if there was a minhag where there was such a custom, instituted the reading of the Targum of Onkelos. Why did he institute the reading of Onkelos? Of the Targum? Because the Jews just came back from Babylonian exile. They needed that language. It's true. Many Rishonim say Targum Onkelos. The Marsha points it out also, but it's brought down to Rishonim. Targum Onkelos was given over at Sinai, but it was given over at Sinai because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew that ultimately the Jewish people are going to need a Targum when they come back from Babylonia. So God made it dependent upon the prophets. Now, why the prophets? For future generations. But it's interesting. Part of the purpose of Kabbalas Torah we see from Amalek, because the Jewish people said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu u'mayim. Is God in our midst or God is not in our midst? And now we make a bracha before we learn Torah, before we get an aliyah. We make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed is you, God. In other words, when we learn Torah, we have to, in a sense, not just see that we're reading a book. We're thinking how to answer a question. We're trying to understand what God is telling us. Davening, we talk to God. But when we learn Torah, God is talking to us. And we say, Baruch atah Hashem. When we learn Torah, you, God, are there. There is a dispute between Reb Chaim Volozhiner and the Balatanya what the Torah Lishma means, but everybody admits that there is an inyan of dveikus, of feeling close to God when you learn Torah, to see that God is talking to us. It's just a definition of what Torah Lishma means and what our focus has to be. But certainly the Kriyas HaTorah, what was the problem? Ninalu, they became tired. When a person becomes tired, he's not aware of what's going on so well. When a person is sleepy, he gets confused. When a person dreams, the things that were done to him by one person, he can see in his dream being done by another person. When a person is not in control of his thinking. That was the problem. The Jewish people in the desert, they were bitter. Because they were bitter, they, in a sense, confused what Paro did, and they blamed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in doing that, they sometimes made Paro innocent. They blamed HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they blamed Moshe, they blamed the redemption for the crimes of Paro. That was the transference. It wasn't just a one-way transference. It was a two-way transference. And the Gemara says, Nilu, they became fatigued because they didn't have the water of Torah. When we become dehydrated, we become tired. And it's very interesting. The Jewish people at the time of Amalek, what did they say? Hayesh Hashem b'kibeinu u'mayim. There was no water there. Is God in our midst? Is God in our midst? So is God in our midst? So they asked, is God in our midst? So as a result of that, Vayavo Amalek came. And the Jewish people had a battle for themselves. But then Moshe Rabbeinu went on top of the mountain and he raised his hands in prayer. And the Jewish people were able to see that their success was dependent on Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer. In other words, they saw that it was God that gave them the ability to defeat Amalek, even though they did it themselves. And what does Amalek? What does Amalek do? Amalek comes and said, Ki yod al kes ka, milchama Hashem b'amod midor. God raised his hands, and he's ein kisi shalem, vein shmi shalem, at yimach Hashem Amalek min olam. Until Amalek is destroyed, my name is not complete, and my kisei, my throne, is not complete. Why? Amalek doesn't want people to have familiarity with God. He doesn't want people to recognize God. And when the Jewish people say, is God in our midst? They refuse to recognize God's presence. So then Amalek comes. Because Amalek is dedicated to the idea that God should not be recognized in the world. And certainly his malchus, his kingship should not be recognized in the world. What is the idea of Kriyas HaTorah? Kriyas HaTorah is not just the reading of 3 psukim or 10 psukim. The idea of Kriyas HaTorah, I think, is recognizing the law, the decree of God. Where do we learn out that there should be 10 psukim in the that there are 7 aliyahs after the time of Ezra, because of the Shlosha Shomrei. We have 3 aliyahs. We have 3 aliyahs on Monday and Thursday. We have 5 Aliyahs on Yom Tov. We have 7 Aliyahs in Shabbos. Where do we learn it out? From the guards by Achashverosh, the Shlosha Shomrei Hasaf, and the Chamisha and Shiva Roei Pnei HaMelech. That's what Rashi says. Tosfos says, how can you use Achashverosh to decide, to use him as an example, how many aliyahs we should have? But the answer is, I think it's very simple. The purpose, after the Jews went into exile, the foreign rulers became their king. And in order that the Jewish people should recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that king, that the ultimate king was HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is God. So they use things that are associated with kingship to identify the idea. And we see when we talk about the Shira at the end of the Birchas Kriya Shema, we always identify it. The Shira itself ends Hashem Yimloch L'Olam Va'ed by the recognizing God as king. So that the kingship of God is the kingship of God. We recognize the kingship of God. They were able to identify, became a need, in order that the Jewish people should recognize that God is king when they returned from Babel, by using the examples of their exile. In the exile, there were 3 gods, 5 gods, 7 gods by a king. So the Kriyas HaTorah, what is Kriyas HaTorah? Kriyas HaTorah is not just reading the Torah. Kriyas HaTorah is sensing the presence of God. God is in their midst, recognizing God's presence. But when we recognize God's presence, we have to recognize God as king. And when do we recognize God as king? We recognize him as king when we accept his laws, when the king is able to rule. The kingship of God can't be compared to the kingship that you have a king and queen of England, a figurehead. There's some Jews that want that. They want God as a figurehead king. No, the true king is the one who is able to, who's accepted by the people, recognized by the people. And at the same time, his laws are accepted by the people. And that's the idea of Kriyas Torah, because the Torah represents the laws of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when we read the Torah, we are not only sensing the presence of God, feeling close to God, but we are recognizing his kingship. And that's why originally it was given over to the Nevi'im, because it is through the Nevi'im, it is through the prophets that we feel closest to God. The prophet is the one who gets the message from God and brings it to the Jewish people. And this was the problem. The Jewish people, in a sense, first, they only attributed, initially, they identified God with that which Paro did. And Paro then became the noble king. And they're constantly saying, let us go back to Egypt. But the idea of Kriyas HaTorah is that we recognize God as king. We accept his Torah. And it's not, in Chas v'Shalom, we are not rejecting HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this was the idea. The Jewish people became tired, when the state of tiredness and thirstiness for spirituality, that causes confusion. And as a result of the confusion, they misunderstood and they attributed to God, they blamed God for what Paro did to them. And when we have Torah gives us our spiritual waters that refreshes us and gives us the ability to recognize the very truth. This is the lesson of Kriyas HaTorah.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. I have an interesting question here. The halacha is if you're not sure how to write a letter, you look in a Sefer Torah, which is known to be correct.
Rameir, yeah.
So in the time of the Gemara Megillah there, that it's saying they forgot which letters were the Sofit letters, why didn't they look in a Sefer Torah to see which ones went at the end of the word and which one went in the beginning of the word?
Again, because my feeling is, that question is asked by all the Rishonim, by the way. They don't mention that Gemara, but they say, why didn't they look in the Sefer Torah to see? So, first of all, some of the Rishonim say because there was confusion, and we could attribute it to the Golus, so they had all kinds of Sefer Torahs that had it in different ways. That's one thing. But the second thing is, I think the simple answer is because there was a change in the alphabet. The old Sefer Torahs had the old alphabet, so they couldn't tell.
Okay, another question. If our closest was through Nevi'im, then how was our closest not Hashem since the Nevi'im ended?
Okay, when the Nevi'im ended, I'm not sure what the question is, but when the Nevi'im ended, many of the things were then transferred. In other words, in a sense, and that could be the reason why they had to add more psukim and all of that. That was because in the first Beis HaMikdash, so it was easy to sense the presence of God. The Gemara mentions there were many miracles that took place in the first Beis HaMikdash that didn't take place in the second Beis HaMikdash. As a matter of fact, the Aron itself, in the first Beis HaMikdash, to a certain degree, was exposed. It was on the upper level. They used to, at the time of the Shlosh Regalim, they would push the curtain aside to people to see the Kruvim. The Kruvim face each other, and the second Beis HaMikdash, the Aron was hidden. The Aron was hidden, so there was less revelation in the time of. There was almost no revelation in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. So that's why there had to be a greater focus on Kriyas HaTorah to give us that connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat.
It's interesting, this 10 psukim, some say, is that corresponds with the Aseret Dibros. The Aseret Dibros, there the Jewish people heard the voice, or the sound of the voice, according to the Rambam, the sound of the voice of God. And so it represents this idea of that sensing the presence of God in the most maximum way. That became necessary in the second Beis HaMikdash. So 10 psukim represents this idea of hearing, not just reading what God said, but in a sense almost hearing what God said. And even the Asara Maimaros, the 10 decrees by God in the creation of the world, the Stakel B'Taraso Boro Lomo. The world was created on the base, the God used, the Zohar says, the Torah as the blueprint for the creation of the world. And we stay, Histakel b'Taraso, Histakel b'Olama. How does one come to recognize God? By looking at the world, by looking at the Torah. But, we look at all these scientists, and all the scientists, they're atheists and all that. What's the idea? The idea is it's not enough. When you look at the world, you have to recognize the Torah in the world. You have to recognize the Torah as the blueprint of the world. And only then you could see God in the world. So that's the correspondence of these 10 psukim. And then I think the expression that says that it's Asara Batlanim, according to some, the 10 that sat and learned Torah. These were people who in a sense, they didn't have distractions from Torah. So part of the reason we sometimes forget about God is because of the distractions we have in life.
Okay, thank you. There aren't any more questions here. So just want to thank you for the share. Thank everyone for coming. Remind everyone that we're starting at 10:30 Chicago time now. And besides for being able to listen and watch the shiurim on YouTube, we are now also posting the audio shiurim on yutorah.org. So more opportunities for everyone to catch up on the share or to pass it along to other people who aren't able to be here. So thank you, everyone, and have a good week.